Okay, today we're going to talk about creating the base map and the concept plan. Again, you have to remember that these are steps that may or may not be needed for every single design, but the more complicated the designs get, or the more things that your clients want in their designs, the more likely you are to need something like this. So, if you can obtain either a mortgage survey, a site survey, the plot plan from the client. This should show the property lines, house locations, right-of-ways, easements, anything like that. That's a legal thing that you have to pay attention to. A mortgage survey in particular, will probably show decks, driveways, fences, other permanent things. This would be an example. You can see in the back here, we've got a wooden deck. So obviously this is a waterfront property, but you can see what the different lots are. You can see the acreage of the lot. Here we have a 50-foot right-of-way. We'll talk about what those things are in a moment. You can see walkways, you can see driveways, you can see the house with a deck there. That prevents you from having to do a whole lot of measurements. You can see fencing and things like that. So this might be an example of something that you would get from a client. If you can't get it from the client, your city usually maintains these things. All right, so some terms you use a lot. Sometimes it's also called a plot or a plat. Right? That's the property. That's the property that we're talking about, particularly residential property. If you have to have a survey done, a surveyor will come out and look for the property stakes, the rebar that locates the edges of the property. They're usually buried below the surface, so they might come out with a metal detector. A right-of-way is a publicly owned area where the city can come in and do maintenance and things like that. It usually starts from the middle of the road. It changes a little bit based on whether you have sidewalks or not. I'll give you some examples in a second. And usually we say the footprint of the house is specifically where the house is located. Okay, a right-of-way. It's publicly owned. It includes the street and the ground up to the front of the property line. The size varies a little bit. 50 feet is pretty typical. If you have sidewalks, the property line goes right before that. If you have no sidewalks, it's usually about 10 feet from the curb. So when you're talking about sidewalks, that little hell strip, the tree lawn, that is officially owned by the city, even though you might have to do the maintenance for that sort of thing. The city has access to these things. They can pretty much do what they want. Your local zoning codes may have different things that you can or are required to do with them, so you want to check with your local government to see if there are legal ramifications from planting or removing things in that area. So here are some examples. You can see with sidewalks, the right-of-way starts in the middle of the street and runs from the edge of the sidewalk so that they own the sidewalk and the hell strip. If there's no sidewalk, you can see over here, roughly about 10 feet in from the curb. So you might see expansion joints being utilized there. You can start to see different areas, but most of the time you're talking from the middle of the street, roughly to about the end of the sidewalk. An easement may be a strip of land that others have access to. It's not necessarily the city. Utilities are the most common for this. Fences are usually allowed on an easement. You might have to check the zoning for an area, but you might not be allowed to build permanent structures, sheds or decks or things of that nature. And an easement will be, utilities can come in there and maintain lines, maintain electrical lines, maintain gas lines, those sorts of things. So here might be another example. So here we have a 50-foot city right-of-way that's going to run from the middle to either end of the sidewalk. You can see where the sidewalks are on this side. Here we have 5-foot easements on the property. So this right here, this long line with the 2 dashes and then a long line and 2 dashes, there's your property line. Then you have a 5-foot easement on either side of that line. So in other words, 10 feet that utilities have in between properties that they can run and do whatever it is that they need to do. And in the back, it's 7.5 feet for drainage purposes and for utility purposes. Each city is going to be different. So if you're working within cities that have zoning codes, you're definitely going to want to check with your local zoning commission to find out what the codes are for your area. Then finally, we have a setback, which is the minimum distance from a property line for permanent structures. So here would be an example of that. So here you can see we have a utility easement, we have a drainage easement off the property line, and those are different. Here for a setback, this is a permanent building, and it has to be located a certain distance from the property line and a certain distance from the back property line. And so that would be the closest you could locate that in the corner. So you can start to see different things that might happen and why it's important that you communicate with your clients exactly what the rules and regulations are, and you want to see these things on the plot plan if at all possible. Finally, those of you who end up working with housing associations, you might have covenants, other restrictions as to the colors that houses can be painted or structures can be painted, the plants, the plant height, the parking spaces. My parents lived in an area where you weren't supposed to plant anything other than native plants, for example. My sister used to live in an area where she lived in Florida. She used to live in an area where you'd had to have 3 palm trees on the property. So there are some weirdo restrictions sometimes. I'll give you a word of warning. There's always a neighborhood watch. There's always at least one person in these neighborhoods who are paying strict attention to the rules and are happy to report anybody who's not paying attention to the rules of these things. If you're going to do sketching, and sketching is a great way to get ideas down on paper, to start discussing things with clients, bring some graph paper, bring some grid paper, because that can really improve the accuracy of your sketches. You can just set each box to be a foot, 2 feet, 5 feet, whatever it is you need to be, depending upon the size of the property. And include the right-of-way in your drawings. Again, we've talked about this. Keep your measurements consistent. All right, so just some tips for double-checking things. Keep in mind that if you get a mortgage survey and it is 1 inch equals 30 feet, that's not going to be nearly as accurate as if it's 1 inch equals 10 feet. So keep that in mind. Double check a few measurements here and there randomly as you're putting things on paper. So that would be the base plan, getting all of the permanent things on the site. Now, your plot plan will get you your house, your fences, etc., etc. You're going to have to add to that windows, downspouts, trees, other things that are not going to change as you are coming in and redesigning or designing this landscape. Now, then you go to the client and they say, well, I need the vegetable garden, I need a place for the kids to play, I'd like a pollinator garden, I want my front yard to look really, really good, and they're going to give you a list of things that they would ideally like to see in their property. So then you have to figure out how you're going to organize all of this by the different functions of the areas. Some of those functions might overlap, but you still have to figure out how you're going to get all of these things to intermix. And so we can do what we call either a functional diagram, or sometimes it's also called a bubble diagram, where you simply lay out all of the things that the client would ideally like, and you start to try to organize that in some way on their property. Now, you'll notice on a bubble diagram, it's not anything that's very accurate. We are kind of getting rough scale in terms of the size. In other words, we've got a fairly large kids' play area. Notice the walkway here is away from the house. It's not dictating any plants that are back in here. We're not even putting any plants on there. We'd like a fairly small patio. If we wanted a larger patio, we would draw somewhat to scale. I'm not saying exactly accurate to scale, but the size of the boxes and the circles and the ovals and things kind of relate in your mind to the general size of what you're trying to do. You're going to want to include everything that you put on your site analysis. Where's their where do they need screening? Where do they have winds coming through? What's a good view? Oh, here's an electrical box. I can't block those sorts of things. Oh, they already have this large tree on site. And then you're going to have to start adding to it all of the client's needs. It's really possible, especially on small yards, that everything that they need is not going to fit into their property. But what you're trying to do is organize things so you can get as many of those things down as you possibly can. This is like a rough draft. And it works really, really well for larger properties where you've got lots and lots of complicated things happening, or the client has a long list. This is not a lot of detail. You are sketching bubbles, broad areas. Here are two completely different ideas for bubble diagrams. You'll notice the one on the right, very, very limited, but still giving you a rough idea of the relative sizes of things. All right, so in other words, we've got a very large woodland garden and a relatively small deck. We have a fairly large area of turf over on the right and a much smaller one over on the left-hand side. So you can see that it's starting to organize things. On the left is a lot more organized. Somebody took a little bit of extra time. Maybe this garden is a little bit more complicated. We've got a lot more needs that we have to get in, but still we are leaving things very, very basic, very, very plain. Notice we've got low planting, focal point planting. We're going to have a grill somewhere. We've got patterns that replicate what we're doing. We are not putting in detail at this point. All we're trying to do is organize everything on the ground plane. It can be very simple sketching. Boxes, blocks. What we're trying to do is leave it somewhat organized. So we don't want to just throw shapes on there willy-nilly. We want to have it somewhat organized and somewhat relative to scale. So even this is fine because it is organized. It's not just thrown on there. I can see the relative size of different things and the importance of those things compared to the other things that might happen. Does that mean that there's no planting going right here? Not necessarily. We're not necessarily 100% convinced what has to go there, but we've managed to organize the large portions of the area. You have to address your client needs. You have to address the site analysis. This is why you need to go out on site and do a good portion of your measurements and talking to the client to find out what it is that they want. That might be a simple site analysis. We need some screening. We've got some open areas. Maybe there's good views of things that we can look at in the back. We want to take advantage of those sorts of things. So those are the types of things that you want to add to it to make sure you in your mind are going to remember these things. Again, they can just notice these lines are squibbly and squiggly. It doesn't make that much difference. Right? But what we're doing is kind of organizing where things are going and how we might get stuff on the paper. Slightly more organized, and again, utilizing patterns to fit everything in so that you can visually see what's turf, what's work areas, entertainment areas, play areas, etc., etc. Consider the size of the areas. Consider the size of the family. Do they need lawn for appearance or lawns for kids? A 4-foot walkway in there? Do you need a 6-foot walkway in there? Are we dealing with wheelchairs and things like that? So we want to make sure we're addressing the sizes of things appropriately. We want to make sure we have enough adequate access for various activities. We need gardens where they're going to have access to water. The last thing your clients are going to do is carry 5-gallon water buckets all the way across their yard to water the vegetables in the back. If you're going to put the vegetables in the back, how are they getting water back there? Do you have a power supply? Is there electricity nearby? Are you going to have to call an electrician to bring something in like that? Is there a gas line? So you have to think of all of these different things and make sure that each area of activity has enough support so that that activity can actually be conducted in that area. How are people walking around the yard? If the mowers and the maintenance folks have to pull up in the alley in the back, can they get the big mowers from the back to the front? Can they get them through the gate? Does traffic flow well? Or is that what you're trying to improve? And then in which case, figure out where people are going to be walking. People will always cut through things. You see this all the time. People will walk through areas and they'll create their own pathways, even if you didn't intend for a pathway to be there. And if you don't think that's true, there's now a sidewalk running at this really odd angle from the apartment village because that's where everybody walked through. So we put a pathway there because that's where people were walking anyways. I highly recommend you draw several concept plans. Just take the list of what the people want and put little bubble areas on there because there's a million ways to organize a property. Here are 3 different concept plans for the exact same property. We've got a couple of different driveways. It may not be very often that you get to put in the driveway. Most of the time the driveway is going to be there. But you're probably going to get to organize the turf areas. You're probably going to get to organize bed areas. You might have clients that have work areas. Maybe they need a shed, a place to store equipment and tools, things like that. So you can see vastly different concept plans for the exact same property. These should not take you more than a few minutes to draw. And this way you could start to see, hey, is this organized a little bit better? Will this particular style get more of the things that the client wants in? So that's important to come up with several ideas. These should not take you a long time. None of these concept drawings, bubble drawings, or things like that should take you more than 15 to 30 minutes, depending upon the level of detail and pattern work that you have to put in there. So don't spend a lot of time on these. Okay, as always, if you have questions, don't hesitate to get in touch.